This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan has caused great tension and controversy across the Taiwan Strait. But the U.S. insists their One China policy has not changed. On Wednesday, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said the provocative act of the U.S. on Taiwan Question is not accidental, but a carefully planned farce that exposes its ugly face of treachery. Does Pelosi's visit have any legal standing? Does the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's explanation of the U.S. separation of powers make sense? And what legal actions can China take as a result of the visit? To look at the matter through legal perspective today, I'm glad to be joined by Professor Huang Jin, Director of the Institute of the U.S. and Pacific Studies in Shanghai International Studies University, Brian Becker, author and show host of Loud and Clear on Radio Sputnik, and Mario Cavallo, Senior Fellow at Center for China and Globalization. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Well, the single key element in the Pelosi's saga is the One China principle, sort of legal standing of China-U.S. relationship. The principle is part of the three joint communiques, which embodies the political commitments made by the two sides, China and the U.S., in establishing their diplomatic relationship. Let's take a look at the big picture of China-U.S. relationship, in particular at the beginning of establishing such a formal relationship with the joint communiques, and in total, three of them actually.
The three communiques are a collection of three joint statements made by the governments of the United States and China. The story goes back to 1971 when former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger made his first visit to China, opening a new chapter in China-U.S. relations. Kissinger met with Zhou Enlai, where the then Chinese premier expressed his hopes for improved bilateral ties. This trip paved the way for the groundbreaking of the 1972 meeting between then Chinese Chairman Mao Zedong and U.S. President Richard Nixon, ending 23 years of diplomatic isolation and mutual hostility. At the conclusion of this trip, China and the U.S. signed the Shanghai Communique, the first communique between the two sides. In the document, both nations pledged to work toward the full normalization of diplomatic relations. The U.S. stated they acknowledge that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. Both sides agreed to respect each other's national sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the two nations agreed to take action against any country establishing hegemony in the Asia-Pacific. The second communique was an achievement of then U.S. President Gerald Ford's visit to China in December 1975. Known as a joint communique on the establishment of diplomatic relations, this document formally announces the commencement of normal relations between the two nations. In doing so, the U.S. again acknowledged China's position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. In addition, Washington also declared it would end formal political relations with Taiwan, and both sides reaffirmed their wish to reduce the risk of international conflict. On January 1, 1979, China and the U.S. officially opened their diplomatic relations at the ambassadorial level. In the same year, at the invitation of then U.S. President Jimmy Carter, then Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping's first visit to Washington raised bilateral ties to a new level. The two governments issued the third communique on August 17, 1982. This document reaffirmed the desire of both sides to further strengthen economic, cultural, educational, scientific, and technological ties. Both sides also reaffirmed the statements made about the Taiwan issue in the previous communique. Washington declared its intent to gradually decrease its sale of arms to Taiwan. The three joint communiques built the bilateral foundations between the two sides.
Well, Huang Jin, I will start with you. Give us some background information. What made U.S. and China approached each other, that's in the 1970s. And then finally, they established this formal diplomatic relationship.
I think the two major factors. Number one, of course, at that time, the Cold War is a heyday, and the United States realized that the split of then the Soviet Union, China, is deep and irreconcilable. Therefore, it serves U.S. interests to form a better and closer relationship with China so that to create a balance against Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, in U.S. favor. Another factor is that United States at that time want to withdraw from the Vietnam War, which of course is a trap. And without China's help, it would be more difficult. So if United States has a good relationship with China or better relationship with China, at that time it is hoped that United States can gain some leverage in withdrawal from Vietnam War, which of course it did.
But obviously, if you look at the communiques, in particular, the first two communiques, until 1979, January 1st, they established a relationship over there. You do see good intentions, like the two partners, come together. Of course, I mean, you can imagine the U.S. will say, yeah, Taiwan is part of China. There's only one China. I respect your sovereignty, territorial integrity. There's no question about that, right?
No, there is some very subtle but significant differences between the two sides. Dr. Kissinger is really, really clever or smart. At that time, China's position, of course, is Taiwan is part of China, no questions asked, period. But Dr. Kissinger said the Chinese on both sides think there is one China and Taiwan is part of China, which means the United States will not take a position on this. This is your problem. How to solve it is between, at that time, the Khmer Taiwan and of course, the mainland China. Because at that time, the ruling party of Taiwan is Kuomintang, which firmly holds the position firmly that there is only one China and Taiwan is part of China. Of course, the two explanations of what China really is. But we have to remember and emphasize that at that time, when the two countries, I mean China and the United States, normalized the relationship, United States did recognize solemnly that there is only one legal representative of China, that is People's Republic of China. In other words, People's Republic of China is a legitimate government, represent the whole China. That position is a common point, is a key point that two countries can normalize its relationship in 1979.
Mario, welcome to the show. Obviously, if the two countries decided to form a formal relationship, and obviously, they each expect the other side respect their core interests. For example, it's like if there's an issue with Hawaii or Alaska, China was expected to respect the U.S. sovereignty and the territorial integrity, obviously, over the entire U.S. territory, including probably overseas territories too. But the same, I would say, is to the Chinese side, right?
Well, we don't have that respect for those original agreements any longer. And the U.S. is acting in its self-interests. We understand that. In fact, I'll even go so far as to say, every country has the right to act in its self-interest. Okay, fine. That's an understandable thing. China does, and I'm glad that they do. But we must look at and acknowledge, and we say if it quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, it's a duck. And what we have here is the United States acting in its self-interest, and they obviously have, as I love to say, my favorite Chinese phrase, 过分了. They have gone over the line. They have breached the one China policy. They have breached this idea of we have China's basis for diplomacy. The basis for diplomacy between the countries is the one China policy. Okay. It's been broken. It's like the United States walking up to the table with, we have we've set 6 dishes nice and neat on the table, and the United States walks up to the table and grabs a dish and flings it and throws it on the floor, and it shatters. That is what we have. I'm not going to be overly aggressive in criticizing it. It's a big, big problem. It's a danger. And I'm not sure what's going to come next.
Brian Becker, welcome to the show. A general question. Do you think today the U.S. is still following the one China principle here?
Essentially, no, but there are still restraints on the United States policy. And it's not really restrained because of the Shanghai communique of 1972 or 1979 or the later communique. It's really restrained, in fact, by the fact that the U.S. is still uncertain about what it wants to do with China. And there may be some differences of opinion. What Nancy Pelosi has done is climbed the escalation ladder publicly in an unnecessary, gratuitous way. She's basically thumbed her nose at China. She's, in essence, had a de facto recognition of the Taiwanese government, Taiwanese authorities as an independent government. And so the U.S. policymakers, the politicians, and Nancy Pelosi is third in line of succession after the president and vice president, they carried out what the Chinese are calling a strategic level provocation. So the question is, to what end? And I think that what's happened is that there's been a breach, an open public breach of the earlier communiques and the acceptance of the one China policy. And what comes next? Will another politician go now to Taiwan? Will the Japanese go to Taiwan? In other words, the snowball will continue to gather force here. And so we're going down the road of a confrontation. And what's really curious about it is what is motivating the United States? What's really motivating the United States to have a confrontation with China in the Pacific? And a lot of people are perplexed by that because they don't see a real reason. But I think it's the logic of American politics. The logic of empire is driving these politicians to take a position that's arrogant and filled with hubris. And ultimately, of course, China must respond.
Some sense of realism here. Let's dig into the legitimacy issue of Pelosi's visit to Taiwan as the U.S. House Speaker. She claims the visit falls under the so-called Taiwan Relations Act and the 6 assurances, but barely mentioned this one China principle. I think this is, upsets a lot of people. What the Taiwan Relations Act is, and if it contradicts the U.S. commitment to the one China principle. Let's take a look.
During her trip to Taiwan, U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said her visit does not contradict long-standing U.S. policy, guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, U.S.-China joint communiques, and the 6 assurances. In fact, she is wrong. Her visit contradicts the joint communique in 1979 establishing ties between the U.S. and China. The joint communique of the United States of America and the People's Republic of China clearly states the United States of America recognizes the government of the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China.
Within this context, the people of the United States will maintain cultural, commercial, and other unofficial relations with the people of Taiwan. The government of the United States of America acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China, and Taiwan is part of China.
Pelosi, second in line of succession for the U.S. presidency, is clearly an official of the U.S. government, which thereby defies the agreement. But this doesn't seem to bother Pelosi, as just 3 months later, in April 1979, the U.S. Congress approved the controversial bill called the Taiwan Relations Act, and changed the wording from unofficial relations to other relations. It also stated the U.S. will continue to provide support to Taiwan, including supplying weapons to reinforce Taiwan's military capability. China registered strong opposition to the act as it legitimized arms sales to Taiwan, an obvious violation of China's national sovereignty and amounts to interference into China's domestic affairs. On August 17, 1982, China and the U.S. issued the 3rd joint communique on U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, where Washington agreed to gradually reduce arms sales to Taiwan and then stop altogether. However, this upset Taiwan secessionists, so the U.S. created the 6 assurances, a document outlining U.S. policy principles to assure Taiwan of its support to the region despite cutting formal diplomatic relations. It also assured Taiwan that the U.S. did not agree to set a date for ending arms sales to Taiwan. The U.S. had played both sides, to the mainland by pledging to reduce arms sales, and also to Taiwan by reassuring the region there was no set date for ending arms sales.
The so-called China Relations Act, cited by the U.S. side, gravely violates the One China principle and the three China-U.S. joint communiques and essentially places domestic law above international obligations. It is illegal, now, and void. On the Taiwan question, the U.S. should abide by the One China principle and the three China-U.S. joint communiques rather than something it unilaterally concocted.
For decades, the Chinese side has consistently opposed the U.S. practice of creating domestic laws to defend their relations with Taiwan.
Well, Huang Jing, I will start with you here. Obviously, the question is is the Taiwan Relations Act contradicting basically the One China principle? The U.S. agreed to follow, to observe. There's only one China, Taiwan is part of China. At the same time, they are developing substantial relations with Taiwan or treating Taiwan like a separate political entity.
Of course, it contradicts. If we look at the issue from the perspective of three communiques as agreed by both sides. Obviously, Taiwan Relations Act is a unilateral product, as you just said. But we have to remember, unilateralism actually is what hegemony is all about. I mean, a very important demonstration of a hegemon is that it can do things unilaterally, and the United States has been doing this all the time. Doesn't matter who is in the White House. But the point here is that you cannot and should not, one cannot and should not, impose a unilateral decision or unilateral act upon a solemnly, mutually agreed a principle or policy, which is a foundation of the normalization of the relationship between two major powers. That, I think, is a very reckless and also in long term could lead to a disaster which would damage the interests of both sides. Having said that, we also have to acknowledge that Taiwan Relations Act actually is a play of the domestic politics of the United States, which has remained a major problem in the bilateral relationship vis-a-vis the Taiwan issue. For example, this visit of Pelosi to Taiwan is actually, in my view, in a large part because of the internal politics of the United States. Mm-hmm. Of course, what is damaged, again, is a bilateral relationship of the United States and China, and in my view, also the interests of the United States itself.
Mm-hmm. Brian Becker, here you have this, internationally, country-to-country relationship. Of course, there are some basic rules, basic principles you follow. Many people would say that's a UN Charter. If you take a look at that, that's the basic respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. And then you can conduct the normal country-to-country relationship. But here, it's not completed that, right?
That's an extremely important point. It's no surprise that there is rivalry between different entities, especially major countries. The question really is it a managed rivalry? And if it's a managed rivalry, which is the thing that prevents it from breaking into all-out war or confrontation even accidentally, if it's a managed rivalry, it has certain foundational principles, and it has, as the Chinese have also said, and I think this is an apt metaphor, certain guardrails so that the car doesn't go off the road. And the guardrail really has been the One China policy, the One China principle, the fact that Taiwan, as Jimmy Carter made it explicitly clear, that Taiwan is part of China and that the U.S. acknowledges that Taiwan is part of China. For Nancy Pelosi to crash through the guardrails, to basically tear down the guardrails, so that as the car, and let's think of the car as the rivalry between China and the United States, or the relationship between these two countries, as the car goes around the curves and up and down, and there's no guardrails, it becomes very dangerous. And that's why, it's correct to call this a strategic level provocation. Why did Nancy Pelosi feel confident enough to do it? I mean, this has been Nancy Pelosi's position for a long time. She's a China hawk. And I think it's because Biden has said on 3 different occasions, so it's not a stumble, 3 separate occasions, that the U.S. is prepared to use military force when it comes to Taiwan. And this follows 4 years ago when the Pentagon released its new quadrennial report, its new doctrine, preparing our country, America, for a major power conflict with China. So the compass has been reset. The guardrails are being torn down, and that's what makes this such a precarious, dangerous moment. And frankly, I want to say this so that the Chinese audience and the universal audience, the international audience, hears that this is not what the American people want. After Vietnam and Korea and Iraq and Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya, war after war, the last thing the American people want is a confrontation, especially with China.
Well, good point. Obviously, China is not Iraq, Libya, or Syria. As we mentioned earlier, arms sales, to Taiwan is another soaring point between the 2 countries. Some would say another example of how the U.S. goes back on its words. Here is how former U.S. Ambassador Ches Freeman recalled that part of history.
In the 1980 campaign, Ronald Reagan disagreed both with normalization with China. He wanted to restore official ties to Taipei, and he also thought that Taiwan should be able to buy whatever weapons it wanted in the United States. This led to a crisis that was about 18 months long and culminated in negotiations over the course of 1982. Most of them conducted at my dining table in my apartment in Sanlitun in Beijing, and this resulted in a communique in which basically both sides had to be more explicit, but return to the normalization understanding. That is, the Chinese had to accept that the U.S. was going to continue arms sales for a while to Taiwan. The U.S. had to accept that it couldn't do so indefinitely. But on that basis, we reached a compromise, and it produced exactly the results that we'd hoped for. It gave Taipei an incentive to drop its refusal to talk to Beijing and to enter into a political dialogue with it, which then resulted in the so-called One China consensus. In other words, Taipei had to look for non-military means of managing its security and autonomy vis-a-vis the rest of China. And Beijing had a powerful incentive to send every signal it could of peaceful intent to keep the U.S. reducing the arms sales to Taiwan. And that worked for 10 years until the 1992 election, when election considerations catalyzed a decision to make the largest U.S. arms sale ever to anywhere, 150 F-16s to Taipei. That broke the communique framework and effectively remilitarized the issue, an issue that had been demilitarized.
Mario, obviously, the third joint communique between China and the U.S. said that the U.S. made promises to reduce arms sale to Taiwan. Over a period of time, they will stop arms sale to Taiwan. And then later on, they basically flip-flop their decision. They say, oh, there's no cap on arms sales to Taiwan. What do you make of this kind of, flip-flopping in dealing with another country?
What I make of this type of flip-flopping, specifically that you're mentioning, is just really an earlier example of what we have now that's escalating, which is obvious. We have a specific, intentional, I even want to go so far as to say disrespectful, breach of the One China policy. When Pelosi spoke on soil, standing in Taiwan, in the morning of her remarks, she referred to our countries. And she was talking about the United States and Taiwan. So we just have a direct breach. And what I think I want to do now is talk more about the question that's really on everybody's mind, which is to say, why is the United States acting so incredibly recklessly? And in order to answer that question, all we have to do is look at what's happening around the rest of the world. Now, this all began, 70 years ago, post-World War II. It's disturbing to me because, I'm an American. People like myself, other politicians in America, like Tulsi Gabbard, economists like respected Jeffrey Sachs. We're all scratching our heads as Americans. We're disturbed by what our government is doing because it's on a warmongering warpath. And there seems to be no country except China that they have been unable to contain. You know, small countries, the small little countries in Latin America and the Middle East, they devastated those countries. They were able to contain them. But every step of the way, they've been trying for years and years to contain China. And what has happened? What do we have? What's this paradigm we have for 20 years? We have a rising China and a declining imperialist, hegemonic America. And we've gotten to the end of the line where they know they lost. I want to say this very clearly. Okay? They tried to contain China. They've been unsuccessful. China is now the largest, safe, stable, successful, capable, civil, successful country on the planet. It really is. I mean, they've gone by many, many measures far beyond the United States.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of frustration in the United States, and they are lashing out.
Yeah, you live in China for many, many years. Sure, you have the real experience, Mario. But let's take a look at this quickly. You know, the impact. You know, how does the other countries or the international community responded to Pelosi's controversial trip? Will the trip affect the international consensus on the One China principle? Here's the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
Our position is very clear. We abide by General Assembly resolutions, by the One China policy, and that is the orientation that we have in everything we do.
Huang Jing, what's your view on this international impact? Are you afraid of, like, the broken window theory? Other foreign officials will also visit Taiwan, make it like, breaching this One China principle, create a lot of trouble between China and those countries?
I think that any person with fair mind can see that Nancy Pelosi's visit is reckless and dangerous and serves only her interests or maybe the interests of the interest groups that she represented. And it violated not only the mutual agreement and principles between the United States and China, violated the One China policy, but actually it also damaged, to a large extent, in my view, the interest of the United States itself, because they put the United States right now into a danger, a brink of a confrontation with another major power at the doorstep of China, which, in my view, the United States may be very difficult. Despite its hegemony, the United States may not be able to prevail if a confrontation happens in this area, and will be great damage to the United States and its credibility as a so-called world leader. But the problem is, number one, we have internal politics, which is hijacked by political correctness. And second, we have some problem with so-called allies, like G7 countries, also hijacked by this political correctness, and also, of course, by this, in my view, unrealistic ambition, want to maintain themselves on top of everybody in this world we call human beings community. That's a problem. So therefore, they try to take advantage of the discourse dominated by the so-called major media, by them, try to put China on the wrong side, which is ridiculous. All of this happened because this lady's reckless and dangerous behavior, and now they try to put blame on China, and I think that's a problem. In other words, this entire rationality in decision making has been hijacked by internal politics of the United States, by the uncertainty of U.S. politics, and by this kind of division, deep division of the United States, and also, of course, hijacked by hold hostage of the so-called political correctness in that part of the world, which I think is very, very dangerous for all of us living in this global village.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, we conclude today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qianzhuo. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.